Hello, and welcome to Forward Theatre Company's production of Feeding Beatrice, a Gothic tale by Kirsten Greenidge. I'm Marcella Kearns, Artistic Associate at Forward, and I'll be your guide through an introduction to our production, a Wisconsin premiere. This is Forward's first foray in a very special respect. With Beatrice, Forward makes its first venture into horror, into psychological thriller. Greenidge sets her piece within a Gothic atmosphere, which has the effect of heightening the conditions and history that she addresses in her play. So, first, why a Gothic setting? What about it captivates us and digs into our psyche? As we've just come out of the height of spooky season and are entering a barer, cloudier, darker time, this may feel familiar. Gothic literature was born of fear. A shadow side of Romanticism, Gothic lit began to rise overseas and on our own continent as accelerating changes in technology, science, and philosophy sparked fundamental questions. Just what was the beginning and end and possible continuance of life? How would advances in science and tech shake the foundations of what humans thought they knew, with beliefs colliding with development? How did the decline of some systems of class, rank, status, governance, and more uproot or rattle the settled? Think Mary Shelley's brilliant examination of human responsibility in light of scientific development and her caution about trying to play God in Frankenstein. Think Edgar Allan Poe's tales in which the psyche is bent under the weight of the unexplained. The fiction, as it falls under this category, goes back to the mid-1700s, but we really see its lineage from the epistolary novel Dracula through Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House and other stories, and its influence on Stephen King. It's a realm of crumbling castles, cathedrals, and houses, gnarled trees, and just caught glimpses of something moving out of the corner of your eye. It's darkness, storms, sickness, madness. It's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the picture of Dorian Gray, Rappaccini's daughter, and Rosemary's Baby. Down even to daily pop culture, think of that signature goth style, a style that's meant to conjure the disturbing or unsettling. Here are some characteristics of the genre as you'll experience them very specifically in Beatrice. An atmosphere of dread, the presence of a supernatural, perhaps unnameable or unexplainable force, darkness from storms to shadows, a space that's in decay. Romance, yes, romance with a significant challenge to it or corruption that is building within it. An unfamiliar place, isolation, a growing psychological pressure that may blossom into madness or spiritual or moral horror. Specifically, in Feeding Beatrice, we meet a loving couple, June and Lurie, who have just bought a house in the suburbs. They are new to the space, which needs, as we discover, significant renovation. When we meet them, June is making a list of what to tackle first. And as the story progresses, we learn that they are the only Black couple in the neighborhood. They are at a distance from their family, and June herself has some difficult history in her family. And their first visitor, a young white teenager named Beatrice, seems both friendly and strangely out of tune and time. No spoilers, but the secrets that June and Lurie uncover and then have to cover require an escalation in construction and deconstruction in the house, subjection to a horror only partly revealed for a time, and increasing isolation from an ally, Lurie's brother Leroy. Second, as to why Forward makes this foray, the genre only seems fitting for an exploration of the rotten underbelly of the idea that we call the American dream. On horror itself, our production dramaturg, Khalid reminded the team of how audiences of different races experience the genre through a reflection by James Baldwin that I'd like to share. White people don't know what horror is, so argued James Baldwin in his 1976 book-length work of film criticism, The Devil Finds Work. The last film he discusses is The Exorcist from 1973, a film that unnerved him not because of the devil that's in it, but because of the devil that is not. Blood, vomit, and affluent little girls using foul language all seemed pretty tame compared to America's actual record of enslavement, torture, discrimination, genocide, and murder. The mindless and hysterical banality of evil presented in The Exorcist is the most terrifying thing about the film, Baldwin writes. The Americans should certainly know more about evil than that. If they pretend otherwise, they're lying. And any Black man, and not only Blacks, many, many others, including white children, Baldwin says, can call them on this lie. To summarize, white audiences and audiences of color may see the genre differently, first, and what makes the horrific so, second, simply by virtue of their lived experience. A little bit about horror noir, or Black horror. Jenna Puffgray, who directed Beatrice, and Khalid studied the experience of Black characters and audiences in modern and contemporary horror in preparation for rehearsal. Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which is a documentary based on Professor Robin R. Means Coleman's book tracing the history of Black horror from the late 19th century to the present, digs into just how the genre has evolved. Khalid explains that the traditional horror film is an unsettling film designed to frighten, panic, cause dread and alarm, and invoke our hidden worst fears, often in a terrifying, shocking finale. The genre does this, even as it captivates and entertains us at the same time, as it gives us a cathartic experience. A Black horror film is one thing. A film with a Black person or Black people in it is another. Black horror films are horror films made by Black people for a predominantly Black audience. On the other hand, a horror film with Black people in it is just what it is, a horror film with Black people in it. These films have a history, the documentary relates, of really misrepresenting and misusing Black characters. With the radical success of filmmaker Jordan Peele's Get Out in 2017, a long arc of defining and reclaiming Blackness in horror really reached a stunning clarity. Black history is Black horror, the documentary asserts. And the film, about the violence of suburban whiteness, I'm quoting, and its facade of liberalism in the face of racial equality, helped pave the way for Black artists and filmmakers to mine the tropes and scaffold of the genre to tell stories in which audiences of color may see themselves reflected both in history and in the daily, and in which white audiences may find themselves discomfited as they confront their own understandings of just how healthy our society and culture is, and their own experience of implicit bias, fragility, or privilege. In an article by A.A. Dowd about the phenomenal work of Peele, a comedian for most of his career, we see his influence. Dowd says the work positioned him as a keen cultural commentator, someone interested in holding court on the anxieties behind the headlines and raising a funhouse mirror up to our culture war age. Watching his films, you get the impression that he's trying to make sense of the here and now. Today, all it takes is Peele's name on a film for it to be guaranteed success. He's tapped in. This genre is growing, and you're here to see what I've heard some refer to as a Jordan Peele film on stage. But interestingly enough, this play was written far, far before the inception and interest in this particular aspect of horror. So let's take a look at Kirsten Greenidge, our featured playwright, and her deep dive into this subset of the genre. First, Jen Gray has directed Greenidge's work before in the mid-2000s. Forward and our advisory company had been looking for a ghost story for some time, and this play really fit the bill. Of Beatrice, Gray says it has a powerful voice, fascinating characters, and it continually surprised me. It was wildly entertaining. Prior to the launch of rehearsals, Jen sat down on a Zoom call with Greenidge to talk playwright's viewpoint and story and character details. With questions such as, what is the nature of the relationships with Lurie and June to Leroy, Jen had the benefit of contact with the playwright to bring insights and some secrets into the rehearsal hall to enrich character building. On a side note, Greenidge actually envisions the play taking place in a very particular area and neighborhood around Boston area, though the text and our production really leave out any specific detail that may reference it. On Greenidge herself, she is the assistant professor of theater at the School of Theater at Boston University. Originally from Boston, she has been writing plays from a very young age. She won her first playwriting award while still an undergraduate at Wesleyan University and has gone on to win a Village Voice Obie and Independent Reviewers of New England Awards, not to mention receiving multiple award nominations elsewhere. She is playwright in residence at Company One Theater in Boston and was recently named Boston's Playwright Laureate by Roxbury Community College. She is working on multiple commissions from La Jolla Playhouse to Playwrights Horizons, and she lives in Westboro with her family. She states, this is directly from her bio, that her work explores the intersections of race, class, and gender, and seeks to place stories and language that are inherently theatrical on the American stage. She seeks to create more multidimensional roles for underrepresented actors of color, more roles for women, and more plays that challenge mainstream audiences and provoke change. One reason I think why Ford was really interested in this piece. Greenidge started writing Beatrice in 1999 and started sending it out around 2001. Her connection to the subject matter, her undergraduate major was in history, specializing in the antebellum South and in slavery, the history of slavery. She had a particular fascination with the idea of the American dream and just how far a couple may go or what they may sacrifice in order to achieve it. She was also inspired partly by Alfred Hitchcock's collection of short stories, Not for the Nervous, she says, specifically No Bath for the Browns by Margot Bennett. The basic idea is that there is a couple, she says, that buys a house. They can't afford it. They agree that they will eat bread and margarine for as long as it takes to pay off the house. They find a body in the bathroom underneath the floor, and they decide just to cover it up and to not tell anyone. As you do. So she says, I thought that was interesting. I was intrigued by that pact and decided to marry all of those ideas together. Greenidge also cites the influence of Toni Morrison's Beloved and, significantly, Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun in the creation of this work. Building on their legacies, she really seeks to tangle with the discrimination that is still very much a part of our lives in the United States. Another side note, another one of her plays, The Luck of the Irish, also handles home ownership and racism in the Boston area. The play explores an instance of ghost buying in which a Black family gives money to a white family to purchase a home for them, as they wouldn't have been able to purchase it themselves given racial discrimination, and the transfer of the home's title. More significantly, however, Greenidge cites the play as an exploration of how privilege and opportunity intersect. Interestingly enough, there is a character mentioned in Luck of the Irish that appears in Beatrice. On Beatrice, what does Greenidge want from want for audiences? In an interview she shared, I obviously want them to feel more than just bad for June and Lurie. I've been thinking a lot about microaggressions in this play that Beatrice is spewing. A lot of it is, oh, I would never do that. Some is, oh, I think I might have done that. So I would hope on a gargantuan scale, she says, that feeding Beatrice will help people look to themselves. How would I mirror that? And for the people of color watching specifically when they see this play, I hope, she says, that we are able to see ourselves and feel that it is a telling story that is familiar to us and not in a way that is solely painful. Building from that detail of microaggressions. Surface horror aside, Beatrice treads upon the toxicity of the American dream and the harm that racist foundations in our society inflict upon Black Americans. Over the last several years, accelerated by the pandemic and anti-racist movements amplified after the death of George Floyd, artists of color in the theater industry spoke out in a comprehensive way with an open letter called We See You, White American Theater, asking for radical transformation of practices in the industry, to challenge all organizations and colleagues to become active collaborators in anti-racist practices. While theaters were shuttered during the pandemic, organizations, including Forward, took time and still take time in active investment in considering and more so implementing what working practices may be instituted, sustained, or magnified in order to support our colleagues of color. From the movement's principles, their principal statements come landmark reminders, really, and prompting to implement best practices as we know them right now, from the office to the rehearsal hall to the theater space. They ask for respecting of skin and bodies. They ask us to address our vocabulary, implicit bias, behavior, and lack of understanding. They cite that safety first is a theatrical motto. Anti-racism is what makes us safe. One of the very complex questions to consider is not only what material is chosen for a season, therefore. So does it ask relevant, important questions of the audience? And is it a worthy story to be told? But also how a producer can create safe working conditions for artists to explore vulnerable or painful material. Actors are often called upon to tell stories that may include harm, sadness, pain, and while, yes, it's their job, that job requires emotional and physical investment. That means they have to juggle well-being off stage. So, fundamentally, how do we take care of those who do that work for us? Specifically, to bring it back to Beatrice, how do we take care of our artists when we explore a story that has deep roots in America's racial trauma? The place to start, dramaturgy. So dramaturg Dini Valone, who most recently worked with Forward on Wisconsin Rights, describes the dramaturg sometimes as the midwife for a production. In many cases, they may research history, culture, outline questions, and research for actors and the director in the room, and often provide research packets to help artists plumb a broader and more informed range of choices as they craft the story in the rehearsal hall. On new work, they often assist a playwright in addressing clarity of a developing story in revision, hence the midwife metaphor. But that's really only just the beginning of how a dramaturg serves. Here on Beatrice, our dramaturg, Khalid Long, started work months ago with Jen to devise a plan for keeping actors safe and open to address, hear, and speak racist content and language in the play while in rehearsal. As preview audiences have said, it's a lot. Long, a cultural historian, and specialist on Black women playwrights, has worked with Kirsten Greenidge's material before. The questions she asks and the deliberate language she uses put the audience into a very self-reflective space. In the rehearsal hall for our practice, actors had one-on-one sessions with Khalid, talked about the play, its implications, and its effects with one another in table work, where we speak around the table, dissecting the play for several days, and instituted a practice really of checking in before speaking potentially harmful language in the script. Khalid spent the first week in rehearsal, has been in touch as a resource, and returned for technical rehearsals to empower our storytellers and be a second eye on the shape of Greenidge's story and production here. I'd like to shift from that part of the process to another, design. I'd like to share some details, if I may, about elements you'll experience here. After the designer run, a rehearsal of the whole play about a week before technical rehearsals, which allows the design team to take in how the director has staged the play and finessed their elements in preparation for tech. The team acknowledged that there were plenty of details that wouldn't come into full clarity until we were in the space. Sound and lighting, essential elements to create anticipation and horror in the audience's mind, would bring story elements into sharp focus once we could take the overture stage. Think the classic example of Jaws. Without the music, would the film be as terrifying? Or the beep monitor in Alien? Would the growing proximity of that human shredding creature incite as much dread if we didn't have the beep? On sound design specifically, June is a former dance teacher, and dance ends up featuring prominently in the piece. Sound designer and composer Joe Cerqua composed a tango that he shared at first rehearsal, draws a bit of inspiration from the Addams Family. How original composition, and that tango contrasts with a cut from film music and another dance altogether, really throws us starkly into that Gothic separation of romance and sensuality versus entrapment in the inescapable. Interestingly, both dances hinge on the push-pull of a power play visually and in their spirit. On movement and dance, Jacob Ashley, the director of school in Madison at the Madison Ballet, choreographed all of the dancing that you'll see tonight. A little trivia: choreography takes up time. Up to about 11 hours of rehearsal were spent finding the right balance of power and building the choreography in each of the pieces you'll see. The choreographer for the play must not only create the dance, but work with the director, just as a fight director might, on how the dance furthers the story happening between characters. Once on stage, dance that took place on stairs, much like Shirley Temple and Bill Bojangles Robinson's work in The Little Colonel, the first interracial dance on film, needed to be crafted for safety and timing with a new element of levels. More so, each dance needed to tell a specific story about power, relationship, and its consequences. On a related note, in the plays, Beatrice speaks often in overwhelming admiration of Shirley Temple and her dancing and friendship with Bill Robinson. Significantly, Kirsten Greenidge speaks about what Shirley Temple meant to her in this interview. She's an all-American girl, she says, what people are supposed to be. She's a symbol of purity and virginity, all of that wrapped into one. Buoyance. I loved Shirley Temple, thought she's doing this, she's singing and dancing. She says that as she was a fan, she also found moments where she thought, I really can't access this, as a little girl who was Black. So she was trying to plumb what was happening in terms of race and gender on screen, and her mother broke it down for her. She remembers feeling, she says, a profound sense of sadness about those feelings, and yet wanting to enjoy them, seeing things that were problematic about America, both as a young girl and as a student of history later on. A little bit more about design. In Scenic, I'd like you to take a look when you see the show. In collaboration with Scenic designer and advisory company member Noele Stollmack, Jen really sought to create the sense of enclosure and entrapment. When you enter the space, you'll see plans for a neighborhood thrown up into stark relief on the back wall and on the floor of the thrust. The rows of houses, to me, really conjure the image of another space with multiple rows of the same size plots. Within the plans, the deconstructed architecture of the house itself, along with packing boxes and unfinished renovation, really marries the dream to the nightmare of decay that is characteristic of the Gothic. The color scheme both blends with light and with the shape and color of the playhouse itself, a space that draws us into its secrets. On lighting design, Jono De Leon, a deputy of the advisory company and a colleague who also works with the Overture Center, built a design that uses both bold, the striking colors that we may see in horror films, such as sickly green and stark red at outer edges and reaches of the stage, as well as the piercing brightness of the supernatural. Jono has sculpted light into the architecture of Noel's design to summon the depth of what's in the house. A little bit about the cast. 3 artists in the cast are returning to us for Beatrice. Jamal James comes to us most immediately from a summer at APT, having previously appeared at Forward doing our virtual season in 46 plays for America's First Ladies. Candace Thomas and Sherrick Robinson returned to us after playing co-workers Des and Shanita in 2018's Skeleton Crew. Alexandra Salter, playing the title character, is actually making her Forward debut. She originally hails from outside the Milwaukee area. To wrap up, I'd really like to invite you, if you'd like to continue your exploration of themes and influences upon Feeding Beatrice, to join us for our free Saturday night lecture series during the run. At 6:30 p.m. in the Rotunda by the Playhouse, 3 speakers on subsequent Saturdays will speak about Blackness and Black horror, the history of redlining and racial discrimination in housing in Madison, and the legacy of Lorraine Hansberry. The last will be conducted by Khalid, whom I'd like to acknowledge and thank now for his work on the production and dramaturgical resources, both for the rehearsal hall and outreach such as this lecture. I invite you to dig into his notes in the program. Meanwhile, ready for a scare? Cozy up and join June and Lori at home in Feeding Beatrice. Thank you for joining me today, and enjoy the show.